Okay, it is 1 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first session of the special summer edition of the Inspire Success webinar series. My name is Brianne Tepler, and I am your host and facilitator. The Inspire Success webinar series brings you topics that relate to the graduate business and technology programs at the College of St. Scholastica. Today's session on sleep, fatigue, shift work, and resiliency in health and human services is brought to you by David Swenson. Dave works with students in the MBA programs. We offer both MBA in rural healthcare and MBA in leadership and change. Applications are now open for the fall semester start with a deadline of August 15th. And don't forget to apply for the Saint Succeed Scholarship as well. Two recipients will get $3,000 towards their tuition for one of those programs. You are joining this webinar today via Zoom. If you're new to this online platform for video conferencing, take note that your camera and your microphone have been shut off and muted. We will have 10 to 15 minutes, maybe a little more, at the end of the session for questions. At that time, you can unmute your microphone or type your questions using the chat function at the bottom of your screen on your menu bar. If you lose connection throughout today's session, log off and call into the meeting using a phone. The phone number to call into the meeting was sent to you in a confirmation email. I've asked Dave to introduce himself, so without further ado, take it away, Dave.
Thanks, Bria. Welcome, and thanks to all of you for joining us today on this topic. I suspect, like many of you, we're all hunkering down at home or probably alone in our offices somewhere. So I'd like you to maybe grab a beverage and sit back and relax. And we're going to talk about sleep and fatigue and shift work and what we can do to deal with the interaction of those kinds of things. I'm the former director of our MBA and professor of business and management at the College of St. Scholastica. And I'm also a psychologist, a practicing psychologist. And I've been in the field for 50 years now, a little over 50 years. Some days it feels like 50 years too. But my interest in sleep actually goes back longer than that. During high school, my junior and senior year, I worked in my parents' bakery. We had a small bakery in Iowa, and I actually was thinking about, instead of going to college, probably taking over the family business. It was quite successful, and I enjoyed baking. I would get up at midnight with my father and go down, and we'd make all the different bread and pie and other kinds of mixes, and we would bake all the cookies and donuts and cakes, and I learned how to do decorating cakes, and it was really, really fun to do. But I noticed about 4 o'clock in the morning, something interesting happened. I stopped being so attentive. I would spill mixes. I would have errors on different kinds of things. I would pinch fingers, and I couldn't figure out why that would happen. And then somewhere around 9 o'clock in the morning, I would start sort of waking up again, coming out of it. And I would work with my father again till 12 o'clock, sometimes 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 12 to 14-hour days. And that's what convinced me that I probably should go to college instead, because I could not manage that nighttime routine. As a freshman in college, I took a psychology course, and there I learned that we spend about a third of our lives sleeping. And I thought in my naivete that that was kind of a waste of time. And so I thought I'd do a little experiment. And so for a week, I decided that I would study. I'd have a lot more time to study. So I would study all week, and I wouldn't sleep for that week to see what happened. I'm not going to do that again either. I was a wreck by the end of that week. My short-term memory was shot. I had trouble maintaining attention in a conversation. I was having little micro sleeps where I just kind of nod off for a minute. But it's those kinds of things that sort of piqued my curiosity. And since then, I've done a lot of consulting in health and human services and emergency services, working with military, law enforcement, and so on, as well as industry, where they have rotating schedules, or where they have long schedules, or where they have really demanding schedules that interfere with sleep. And as a clinician, I also work with people who've had sleep disorders. So what I'd like to do is to share with you some of the experience that I've gained over the years, as well as a lot of research and literature that supports some really fascinating facts and breakthroughs. When we look at sleep deficit, there are a number of organizations that really describe that as a pandemic, that as a nation, we are not getting a sufficient amount of sleep and we suffer for it. So what we'll be covering, I'd like to briefly describe the relationship of work and sleep and sort of the status of sleep in America. And it's kind of a heads up that we really need to be paying attention to that. Now, even though the focus of this session is going to be on health and human services, what we talk about here, regarding sleep and fatigue fits every single industry that I know of. We'll talk a little bit about sleep physiology in the sense of why do we sleep? What's the use of it? What's the benefit of it? And then we'll identify some of the things that disrupt sleep and what the effects of sleep deprivation are on performance. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, what can we do about that? How do we manage sleep more effectively? How do we deal with fatigue? And again, we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end. So jot down those questions and curiosities you have as we go through this. Let me start with kind of a broad view. So far as we know, every animal sleeps. Every animal has a period of time where it slows down. And for most of the mammals, on the one hand, we have the brown bat that sleeps almost 20 hours a day. And on the other end, we have the giraffe that sleeps about 2 hours a day, I suppose because it's a long way to fall down when you sleep. But there's quite a range here, and humans are kind of in the middle of that. We know that little people, toddlers, infants, they sleep somewhere around 13, 14 hours a day because the brain is growing so rapidly. Teenagers need to sleep somewhere around 9.2 hours a day. And if any of you have kids, teenagers, they get much less than that. And we'll talk about that a little later. And adult humans need somewhere around 8 hours, and we'll also talk about how most of us are not getting that. We have not learned the skill of the duck and the porpoise that you see on the screen here. Both of them have learned the knack of turning off one side of the brain for sleep and keeping the other awake. It's fascinating. Even with ducks, if you see ducks gathered together for an evening, there will be ducks located on the periphery of the flock of ducks, and they'll have an eye facing outwards. The other eye is usually closed because that half of the brain is asleep. Same way with porpoises and whales. They would drown otherwise. They have to breathe, so one half of the brain keeps them awake. We haven't learned that yet. But the idea that we sleep in 8-hour blocks isn't necessarily true either. During medieval period, we actually had something called the first sleep and the second sleep. And if any of you were raised in rural areas, you know that at the end of the day, when it gets dark, that's when you have dinner and you go to bed early because you're going to get up early. Well, it was even more defined than that during the medieval period. At about 6 o'clock or so, maybe a little bit later, when it started getting dark, they'd have dinner and then they'd go to bed for about the first 4 hours or so. And somewhere between midnight and maybe 1 o'clock or so, the family would get up and they would do work around the house. They would do work out in the yard. They would visit with neighbors who were also up, or they'd be intimate with each other. And after a couple hours, they go back to bed for another 4 hours. Then they get up at daybreak and go to work. And that was pretty typical of the way humans work. We tend to work in cycles, we sleep in cycles, but the idea of a full 8-hour sleep, it hasn't always been true. Well, what changed that in the late 1700s was the use of gaslight, primarily in England, where people could stay up later and they could go to the theater and they could go to other forms of entertainment. But what really broke the bank was when Edison developed the electric light. That gave us our 24/7 society, and we have benefited and we have suffered for it ever since then. Because now we can stay up at all hours, we can work through the night, and we do. And there are benefits to that, but we pay the price in our health because our basic physiology is to be daytime creatures. And by the way, I have a daytime creature, my cat right here, calling for my attention. So he may jump up and walk across the camera here at some point. Please forgive him. But the current status of sleep and fatigue is, according to the National Sleep Foundation, is that it is a public health epidemic. And in fact, if you look at westernized countries, it's really another pandemic. People don't get enough sleep, and it shows up in their performance and their health. If you go back to 1960, and perhaps some of you were around in 1960, And here's my cat now. In 1960, people were getting about 8 or more hours of sleep. And it was, come here, buddy. And it worked pretty well for people. But as you see, by 2020, sleep has dropped significantly. And now people, on average, are getting somewhere around 7 hours or less. We'll talk about what the implications of that are. But the idea is here that as we have become more sophisticated in the way we work, at the same time, we have lost an understanding, appreciation, and a practice of healthy sleep practices. And it's largely due to work. One of the quotes I heard many years ago from some of my friends in Europe, it says, "You Americans are crazy. You live to work. In Europe, we work to live." But we value that work ethic. We value having those smartphones. We take those with us when we're on vacation, when we're off duty at night. We've lost the boundaries. We've lost the barriers. We've lost the protections for sleep. They've become very mushy. And about a third of people in general who work overtime, they're also susceptible to calls at any time of the day or night. Teenagers in particular are, who will have their smartphones on and will receive calls or receive texting all night long. We know in general that somewhere around 86% of people who are late teens and adults report significant sleep problems. The quality of sleep, the depth of sleep, and how it affects their alertness and their performance, whether they're athletes or whether they're driving or whether they're doing financial analyses or caring for patients. In Japan, they even have a word for overwork. It's called koroshi, and it means death from overwork. And there they have schedules that make us look like kindergartners. They really drive themselves very hard. And there are actual cases of people dying from overwork, as well as the accompanying sleep deficit. In the healthcare industry, almost half of healthcare workers get less than 7 hours of sleep. And especially those who work 12 or more hours are at risk of medical errors by as much as 300%. Now, most people, when they recognize that, would say, you know, I want to refuse overtime. I don't want to do overtime. I don't want to do double shifts. But so many of them are fearful of losing their jobs or losing promotion possibilities because they'll be seen in healthcare and human services as not being cooperative or carrying the load. By carrying the load, they risk themselves, and in many cases, they may risk patients. It's also costly to employers. Any employer that has 1,000 or more workers probably loses somewhere around $1.4 million in everything from sick days and absenteeism to lower productivity and accidents and other occupational costs. So it's costly. It's a hidden cost that we need to recognize and build into our policies. So if we look at health and human services, here's kind of a laundry list of some of the things that interfere with the quality of our sleep. And I'm sure you can recognize. So it ranges everything from being on call to trying to pick up those extra hours, shift work, night work, rotations, as well as physical illness where we just don't feel like we ought to be going to work, or where we're stressed out and we need a day off, or special projects such as grants that require that. So all in all, the sleep deficit affects many different aspects of organizational functioning and professional functioning. It's going to affect payroll and HR. There are safety-related concerns. There's certainly productivity issues, everything from morale and being present, but not being very functional, productivity lapses, resistance to change. And in healthcare in particular, everything from hospitalization and claims and GI orders and disorders and cardiovascular complaints and stress and so on. Put all these together, it's a significant concern. So let's talk about what this sleep thing is. How does it work? What is it? There's a German word called Zeitgebers, and it means time givers. And in our society, we have all kinds of cues out here. You're probably wearing one on your wrist right now. We keep checking our watches for time. We have calendars on the wall. We're physically active. We have dinner and breakfast and lunchtime. We interact with people. All of these are cues to keep us awake and alert and to wake us up. The big one, of course, is the light itself, sunlight. And so we have these cues that wake us up, and we are neurologically hardwired to be awake in the daytime and respond to these kinds of cues. And what happens is that as the light comes into our eyes, it goes through the eyes, it goes through the optic nerve, and where it crosses in the brain is a little area called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's right above the hypothalamus. And when it becomes nighttime, excuse me just a second. At nighttime, when it becomes dark, you don't have that light coming in. And so what happens is the pineal body starts producing melatonin. You've probably heard about melatonin that some people take at night to facilitate sleep. That starts a whole cascade of chemical reactions that kind of slow down and shut down the body's system. So bright light tends to turn off the melatonin. Darkness tends to increase the melatonin. We also have what are called chronotypes. And chronotypes are of two. I'm sure you've heard of night owls, people who prefer working at nighttime. And daylarks is sort of the counterpart to that, of people who work during the daytime. They prefer that. Daylarks are the ones who will get up at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and they jump out of bed and they're energized, and that's when their high time is. For night owls to do that, we look like zombies. I'm a night owl myself. On the other hand, in late afternoon, early evening, when night owls finally wake up and are often most productive and creative, that would just stupefy daylarks who are ready to go to bed at that time. But you'll notice it's a normal curve, so we have a lot of diversity in the workforce. The catch here is that if you try to put daylarks on a nighttime schedule, it doesn't work very well for them. They tend to burn out, make errors, have lower morale, be dissatisfied. But the same thing is true for night owls. When you put them in an early daytime schedule rotation or a job, it also is very difficult for them. So obviously one of the implications is to try to find out when people are extremes in daylark or night owls, to try to fit the job and accommodate to them as much as possible. And they'll be very productive. Another thing that's interesting is that our abilities change as we go through our 24-hour cycle. I won't go through all of these, but here are a couple. By early light, that's when melatonin stops and blood pressure starts to go up a little bit. By early mid-morning, that's when your short-term memory is at its peak, and the stress hormone of cortisol production starts. So it gets us ready to deal with the challenges of the day. By late mid-morning, this is when we're really alert. Our thinking is probably the clearest. By noon, our eyesight is the sharpest. By early afternoon, this is where we really excel in mathematics and financial analysis. Long-term memory is really good. Physically, we're more flexible, we're more dexterous, and our muscles are at their highest strength level. By late afternoon, that's probably why a lot of people go jogging then, because that gross physical coordination, cardio efficiency, reaction time, athletic ability, that's at its peak. By early evening, sense of smell and taste are highest, which is probably good. That's when we eat dinner. That's also a time of highest blood pressure and general body temperature. Then by mid-evening, the melatonin production starts, and this happens every single day. By the way, there are some schools who pay attention to this, some colleges who do. I went to school at Northeast Missouri State University and for my bachelor's and one of my master's. And one of the things we talked about there, we tried to schedule our different courses according to when during the day it would probably best match the sharpness, our cognitive or physiological peaks. If you ask people how alert they are, they're frankly not very good at assessing that. If you ask people how sleepy they are, they'll say, no, I'm okay, I'm okay. But physiologically, we know they're not. One of the ways that you can monitor that is by looking at temperature. So for example, here we might find if somebody is on a rotating schedule, as soon as temperature begins to drop, we know alertness is going to drop. If they're working with heavy machinery or driving or something else that really requires attention, that's a risk factor. So if we know the time at which our circadian cycle begins to drop or change, that's a point at which we can do some things for mitigation. There are a number of people who have researched the effect of caffeine, not too much, But that would be a time that no more than a couple cups of coffee. I don't like energy drinks because you end up with a real drop off after all that sugar. But that would be a time that you could use something, including physical exercise, bright lights, and other ways to try to recover that alertness if it's in a high risk situation. But the alertness and temperature go together, and that's going to tell you when you're beginning to go into that real slump that I should have known about when I worked in the bakery. This is perhaps one of the most important slides because when we sleep, it's not like we just sleep. There are a lot of different stages to sleep. Our brain is as active during sleep, some people say even more so, than it is during the time that we're awake. So let me kind of summarize the high points here. One of the things we know is that there are 4 different stages of sleep. There's the falling asleep where you're kind of drowsy and you're sort of drifting in and out, and you're kind of soaking into your pillow and getting ready for sleep. And at stage 4, it's hard to rouse somebody from sleep. And if you do, they're kind of groggy and disoriented. It takes a while to come out of that. Well, going through these stages, going down into deep sleep and coming back out occur during several 90-minute cycles. It's called ultradian or 90-minute cycles. And we have several of these 90-minute cycles throughout the night. What's also really interesting is we go into what's called non-REM sleep. This is where we're not dreaming. REM sleep, REM stands for rapid eye movement. And if any of you have young children and you've watched them sleep, I'll bet if you look at their eyes, every once in a while, you can see the eyeball moving under the eyelid. Generally, that's related to dreaming, and that's what we refer to as REM sleep. And one of the things you'll notice is that REM sleep gets longer and longer as you go through the night. That's why if you're awakened in the early morning, you tend to remember your dreams more often than if you are awakened later at night, simply because you have more sleep time, more dream time. Now, what's really interesting here too is what do REM sleep and what do non-REM sleep, non-rapid eye movement sleep do? Well, generally, if you don't get enough REM sleep, you end up in the morning with kind of an emotional fatigue. It may be a little touchy, you're just not very responsive socially. And if you don't get sufficient non-REM sleep, then physically you still feel tired. And I want to explain that a little bit more because it's only been the last couple of years we've understood some of that stuff. I also want to mention here that I suspect many of you, if you're physically active, might have an activity tracker on your Fitbit or Charge 2 or some of those kinds of things. They seem to be pretty good for physical activity, but unfortunately, many of these are not that good in estimating what stage you're in or when you transition to another stage. So be cautious about using that as a source of information on sleep, where it seems to be really good for activity. You've probably heard if you're troubled by something, sleep on it. And that's probably pretty good advice. And we finally understand what's going on with that. During rapid eye movement sleep, one of the things that happens is there's a reduction of a hormone called noradrenaline. And noradrenaline is related to fear and anxiety and the fight-flight response. So if you've had a really rough day, if you've been dealing with uncomfortable situations, if you've been involved in an argument and you go to sleep with that, that is going to be upsetting to you. But the other thing that you may notice is during sleep, and I think this diagram is kind of a neat one, it doesn't change your memory for it, but the emotional memory, the emotional part of the memory, by the time you wake up in the morning, it's reduced. You don't feel quite as hot about it. And the reason for that is during REM sleep, if you're able to get good REM sleep and not awake all night thrashing and turning, is that the REM sleep reduces those hormones, reduces noradrenaline and adrenaline, and it reduces the amygdala, which is responsible for that fear response and kind of getting you wired up. And it kind of strips away the emotional tone. So sleep is one of the ways that you can kind of get over the emotional part so that the next day you're able to deal with it a little bit more of a fact-based instant. The other part that's kind of interesting is during non-REM sleep. And this is where your body is repairing itself and rejuvenating the immune system and giving you energy back, and also flushes waste products out of the brain. I'll talk about that in just a second. But this is also where, if you're going through some kind of training, that new memories are consolidated. It's not like short-term memory where someone may tell you a phone number, you remember that long enough to dial it in, but then it's gone. If we're talking about something that's really important, it's during the non-REM sleep where you consolidate that into what you already know so that it's available to you when you want to practice it. So here's something we've learned and confirmed just really in the last few years. This is pretty exciting stuff. Think about your brain. It's one of the biggest collections of cells that you have, and we know that every cell produces waste. Okay, where does that waste go? I mean, it probably would be a pretty good explanation of accumulating for all the bad decisions we see some people making. But on the other hand, it doesn't do that. Where does it go? And just in recent years, what we've learned is during that very, very deep stage of non-REM sleep, what happens is that that deep stage relaxes many of the nerve cells, and the cells that are very, very tight, they begin to loosen up. And cerebrospinal fluid begins to flow through and pick up the waste products that are ejected from the cells. It's carried across the brain, it's absorbed by the veins, and then it's eliminated. And we didn't understand that was one of the major functions of sleep. I think that's really cool. Now, the reason that that's important is because if sleep is disrupted over too long a period of time, there are many researchers who believe that the lack of clearing of those waste products is part of why we end up with the plaques and tangles of dementia. That's one of the hypotheses. That's one of the ideas behind it. We aren't certain of that yet, but it seems like a good working hypothesis. So not only does it get the waste out of your brain, but maybe as we understand this more, we may find a way that sleep is actually a way to mitigate the effects of dementia, and particularly Alzheimer's. There are a lot of factors in our modern living that contribute to sleep disruption. We talked about some of those things unique to Health and Human Services. Here are the kinds of things that I think are fairly common. As you breeze through these different ones, I mean, what's the problem with looking at your cell phone and seeing if you have any messages before you go to bed, or watching television to help you go to sleep? Well, quite a bit, actually. This blue light that is emitted from many of our technological devices actually interferes with the production of melatonin. And so if you have kids who are looking at their cell phone, or if you have your own cell phone on at nighttime, if you have a television that you're watching before you go to bed, unless it has filters for blue light, that's going to delay the onset of sleep by as much as 3 hours, or interfere with it anyway, because one of the things it does is stop the flow of melatonin. We also know that eye strain and migraines and stiff neck and stiff shoulders are also related to using some of these devices, and that too can interfere with quality of sleep. Generally, the recommendation is about 2 hours before bed, get rid of the blue lights. Go back to reading a book, or having conversation with people, or reading stories to the kids, or doing something else that doesn't involve that technology, unless, of course, you have a filter on the blue light. Even then, it's probably not a good idea to watch an exciting TV program before you go. On the other hand, if we know that blue light is what boosts alertness and attention, the time to turn on your TV, the time to expose yourself to bright light, the time to go ahead and check your cell phone is in the morning when you're trying to wake up. And so there is a place for it. But again, we need to be strategic in how we use our habits. Here is probably one of the most damning bits of evidence on the effects of sleep deficits on our daily activities. When we have sleep deficits, in other words, when we have 7 hours or less sleep, the accumulation of that over time, and you can see the gap here. The dark or the blue line is less than 7 hours, getting 7 to 9 hours, that average of 8. You can see the difference in performance on concentration and being distractible, on remembering, both short and long-term memory, even our ability to engage in our favorite practices. Driving, about 50% of accidents that occur every year are related to fatigue and alertness-related issues. Paying attention to our finances and work performance. All of these can be related directly to the sleep deficits. Here's an example of that, by the way. The researcher did an fMRI brain scan, active brain scan of someone doing a math problem after having normal sleep in the upper series here. And you can see that areas of the brain light up as the brain is working on that math problem. With sleep deficit, a couple little areas are lit up here, but basically lights aren't on and nobody's home. And if you remember college time where you would stay up all night long and cram for an exam, research is really clear on that. Not only does it not help you remember, but people perform worse when you try to stay up all night and rehearse something. When we look at sleep deprivation, and I know there are probably lots of you who have worked overtime or double shift or extended duty or in emergencies, and over a period of 24 to 26 hours, you can see how sleep deprivation over that time decreases performance. That's pretty startling. Think of the times, especially in healthcare, where someone may work 24 hours and then have to do an emergency procedure or a diagnosis or some other response. Think about emergency workers, fire personnel, and law enforcement. One has to wonder, with the fatigue, or the behaviors some law enforcement officers engage in, how much of that might be related to fatigue. Well, here's the other thing that's interesting, that this level of sleep deprivation and performance is about the same as when somebody has a 0.08 blood alcohol level. So in other words, when we're fatigued, that's at about the same level as somebody who is working intoxicated. That might be a good argument if you're trying to impress the scheduling and rotating shifts in the workplace. As a psychologist, one of the things that I always do now is to check on a person's sleep habits, because it's often quite likely that it may be misdiagnosed as another condition. For example, I've had people who come in and say, I just can't pay attention anymore. Little things distract me. I can't concentrate and get things done. I find myself overreacting or kind of getting distracted and impulsive. Maybe I have ADHD. And maybe they do, but I found in other cases where it's really sleep disorder, and once they get back to getting adequate sleep, those symptoms change. But I wanted to include this slide for you because, especially those of you who may have various conditions, or if you're working in health and human services, many times insurance requires us to quickly move toward a diagnosis, and sometimes that's premature. One of the things I really encourage all of us in health and human services to do is to be really thorough in assessing a person, and sleep is one of those things. Here are the kinds of presenting behaviors that will get our attention diagnostically, but there may be a mistaken condition. So it's another thing for us to be curious about. There are a number of different screening scales. The Epworth scale is one that's commonly used. You wouldn't use this for diagnosis per se, but if you find that you're kind of scoring on the right end of this, that's a time, if you're not in the field, you should probably talk with your family physician or nurse practitioner or someone else who has some expertise in this. Essentially, it's looking at how likely is it that you would doze off in a situation where you're reading and sitting, or watching TV, or sitting inactive in a public place, or you're a passenger in a car for an hour without a break, and so on. So it's looking at common situations and the likelihood that, that you may doze off. You shouldn't be dozing off. It's an indication that you may have a sleep condition, or you may simply not be getting enough sleep. And it's important to look into for yourself, your family, or your employer. Okay, we're coming down to a point where by now you're probably saying, so, okay, I probably have some sleep problems. What can I do about it? Or how can I help my family or other employees that I supervise or patients I work with sleep disorders? Well, it often is a little bit more complicated than a teddy bear and a blankie, but on the other hand, it can also be pretty simple and straightforward. Let's talk about that. In 2011, the Joint Commission of Health had what's called a Sentinel event alert. And this is where they identified the impact of sleep disorders on healthcare and the risk of errors in clinician sleep deprivation and fatigue. What they came up with for healthcare is something we could apply across all industries. They said, first, let's conduct a risk assessment. To what extent is sleep deprivation and performance problems really a problem for us? Secondly, if we have rotating shifts, how can we ensure that the people on the previous shift are handing off to the next incoming shift what they need to know so we don't have holes and gaps in that? Third, let's make sure we involve staff in work schedules. And as a general principle of management and business, you want to involve people in the decisions that are going to affect them. Fourth, implement a fatigue management plan. And common examples of that is how can you use caffeine strategically, not all day long. In fact, people get jumpy with that, more irritable, and maybe add inattention to it. But if you use it strategically, just before you know you're starting to fatigue, it can raise that for a little bit. Planned napping, even though we often think of napping as, oh, that's a waste of time, it really isn't. I'll talk about that in a minute too. But we need to educate our staff and administrators as well on sleep hygiene. What is sleep? What kind of sleep deficits are going to affect our bottom line, as well as simply our concern about our employees? And if we can have a place for short naps or sleep breaks, how can we do that in a respectful way and understand that it actually improves performance and health and decreases the number of sick days and other complications? Well, recommendations for napping: if you know that you're going to be on double shift or extended duty or some kind of rotating shifts or additional shift, the best time to nap is just before you go on to the shift and prior to some kind of an extended wake period. Before is always better than doing it during. But if you're fatigued during, then a nap is a way to get that. You want to schedule your nap during a quiet period. Somewhere between 10 and 30 minutes, often in the afternoon, is a good way to do that. This provides some sleep during stage 2, which enhance alertness and concentration, memory, decision-making, kind of generally helps with mood and motor skills. And that short period of time, no more than 20 or 30 minutes, it's not going to interfere with trying to get to sleep at night or whenever you're trying to sleep. If you go more into, an hour, certainly an hour and a half, that's very likely to interfere with sleep onset at night. And also, if you go into that deep stage of sleep and you're doing some kind of urgent or emergency work that requires your full attention, you may come out of that deep sleep with what we call sleep inertia. And you're going to be groggy and physically, your motor activity, you may be a little awkward. You're not going to be thinking clearly. So keep those naps to be a short time. And you may want to keep a notebook on what works for you. So over time, you can experiment with that, find the best times to nap, how long to nap, how you feel afterwards. It's a good way to be at your optimal level of performance and health. For managers and executives, again, it's important to involve people in the decisions that affect them. For managers, you want to set those shift rosters early so that people can plan family events and other kinds of necessities around those shift rosters. Otherwise, over time, they can build resentment and frustration because they're out of sync with the other things that they need to do in their lives. Try to minimize overtime and extra duty. I know in so many occupations, it's hard to do that. And people are committed, especially professionals, to their work, and we enjoy largely most of what we do. So we kind of say, yeah, I'll be glad to do that. I'll pick up some extra money, some extra time, but be aware that there's a cost to that. We need to really educate all stakeholders throughout the organization on shift work, overtime, sleep, and fatigue. If they don't understand it, they're going to accommodate that in some way with training and with policy. I think it's also a good idea for managers, supervisors, and executives to go into work, do some night work for a while during the year, see what it's like. It really develops empathy. You can see some of the changes that need to happen. And most of all, do research. Find out what works and what doesn't work and isn't working, and change that in your organization or department. There are a lot of different shift schedules. In fact, internationally, there are over 10,000 different shift schedules. But what we know is that the faster you go through a rotating shift, it minimizes readjustment. It takes about 3 days for people to go through shift adjustment. A good example of that is for any of you who travel. Now, if you're probably in your 20s and 30s and you're traveling internationally across time zones, you know that you can bounce back pretty quickly. 3 days often is enough to do that. And if you prepare for that ahead of time by adjusting your sleep schedule, you can accommodate those time zone changes pretty well. After about age 35, and as you get into your 40s and 50s, it may take up to 2 weeks for people to readjust. So there are age and also some gender concerns about shift work. If you have long rotations of maybe a couple months each, on the one hand, it allows a person to be able to plan. Yeah, I'm going to be working nights for this month or the next 3 months. The problem is on weekends, there's such a temptation for people to go back to their normal daytime style of living, and they never adjust to that shift work. And it has consequences to it. So the long rotations, on the one hand, give a person a reliable schedule. On the other hand, if they're not consistent in applying that on weekends and vacation days and so on, that'll bring their physiology right back down to where they've never accommodated at all. Permanent shifts, even at nighttime, if you're working nights for years, it still does not make a complete shift adjustment for sleep. We're biological creatures and we're oriented to the daytime, and there are costs to that. Hourly and weekly rotations are the worst because people can never get used to that. And the longer your shift, 8 hours again is probably optimal. 10, you can get by with that. 12 and certainly more, longer is worse in terms of the impact on your body, your mind, and your performance. If you use shift work, you want to have forward rotations where you go from a morning shift to an afternoon shift to a night shift. I've talked to people who've done just the opposite, and boy, does it cause havoc with that circadian rhythm. Generally, shift work is better in cosmopolitan, metropolitan areas because there's always something going on. There's plenty of lights and activity, and remember, that dark is that circadian cues. I talk to people who are dispatchers, and they're often located in the basement of a building somewhere, and all the lights are out because they don't want reflection on their screen. Every cue there is go to sleep. And so every once in a while in the news, you'll see some kind of a news broadcast criticizing dispatchers, emergency dispatchers or truck dispatchers, because they've fallen asleep at the switch. Well, all the cues they have are to go to sleep. So in metropolitan areas and well-lit, somewhat noisy areas, active areas, you're getting the cues to stay awake at a time that otherwise you would be asleep. And if you have night shifts, allow 3 days of recuperation, again, remembering that older people still may not respond to that. And if you are up all night and you say, oh, I'm going to sleep in this weekend, I'll sleep 10 or 12 hours this weekend, good idea, but it really doesn't work. Your body needs a longer period of time of normal sleep in order to recuperate. Simply a longer period of time, research shows it pretty clearly, that doesn't cut it. I wanted to conclude with some general sleep hygiene recommendations. In your handout that you'll have, you can go through this in more detail, but I wanted to highlight just a few of these, and then we can open it for discussion. One of the things, if you're an owl, if you're a nighttime person, it's probably better to schedule complex tasks when you're more awake later in the morning, not the early morning. You're going to be stumbling around and zombified if you have to get up really early. Put those off to later in the morning if at all possible, or even the afternoon. Sleep when you're sleepy, and exercise can help you do that. But don't exercise just before you go to bed. Probably no more than 2 hours. Some people say 4 hours before you go to bed. But sleep when you're sleepy. If you don't get to sleep in about 20 minutes, get up and do something else. I had one friend who was a sleep specialist. He said, yeah, do something that you really don't like to do. Take an old toothbrush and some soap and water and go clean around your toilet. You will get bored in no time and want to go to sleep. And so, things like that. Or read a book that's kind of a boring book. The Tale of what is it? Tale of Two Cities is about yay thick. That'll put you to sleep. But sleep when you're sleepy. Sitting around tossing in bed simply becomes frustrating. Then you associate sleep with frustration. Not a good thing to do. I think generally in terms of resiliency, having some kind of a stress management and a relaxing practice, whether it's mindfulness meditation or some other kind of meditation, imagery, progressive relaxation, breathing, yoga, tai chi, some way at the end of the day to signal, I'm starting to kind of wind down now. That and other habits that you have, such as maybe taking a bath or shower, turning the light down a little bit and reading before you go to bed, tucking in the kids, having some kind of a ritual is a way to signal your body to kind of wind down. Diet, exercise, and health are another consideration. And again, exercising regularly is one of the best recommendations, not only for mood, but also for sleep. And if you snore, and don't trust yourself to know if you snore or not, check with a partner, spouse, maybe a neighbor that you're waking up with snoring. But if you're snoring, that can also signal an obstructive sleep disorder. Some people will have a sleep interruption 10, 20, 60 times a minute, where they're never getting down to sleep, or 60 times an hour, and they're simply not going into that deep sleep and they feel like a wreck in the morning. So if you're feeling that way, you might want to talk with your doctor about that and see if a sleep study is indicated. And the sleep environment too is important. Generally, it's not advised to have a TV in your room, not be texting, don't work in your bedroom, keep that separate so that the bed becomes a really salient cue for you to go to sleep or for intimacy. White noise is also possible. A fan or rain or waterfall recording or even radio static is one of the ways to mask all kinds of other sounds, especially if you're trying to sleep in the daytime from nighttime work. One of the things that I experience out here, we have a low frequency wave that sounds like a car parked right outside your window. I still haven't figured out where that is, but recently I've used a fan to kind of mask that a little bit so that I can sleep better. Earplugs are nice, but some people like to be able to hear what's going on around them. So a fan or white noise machine works there. One of the things we know is that light also interrupts the melatonin production. Remember that from our previous discussion here. So you want to block out all light, especially blue light, but you might want to have blackout shades if you have to sleep in the daytime. And even at nighttime, no clock watching. Put the clock across the room, turn it away from you. If there's any LED lights on it, red lights or other kind of lights, block those out. Any kind of light coming in, even with your eyelids closed, some of that will come through your eyelids. So we've covered a lot of things here. I could go on for probably a whole day seminar on this topic. I hope this has piqued your curiosity, and I hope if some of this is sort of a refresher or a reminder that the best way we can take care of our jobs, our families, our personal health is by being at our optimum. And sleep is one of those things that help us do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dave. I am ready for a calm, quiet, cozy nap right now. Just when
I
you're
hope I didn't put you to sleep.
No, no, not at all. But as you speak, I'm visualizing, what does my bed setup look like? Do I have a clock on the nightstand? And just the way you're talking about these ways to calm and get ready, and that sounds really good right now. No, it did not put me to sleep. It was very interesting. Let's open it up for questions from the group. You can either unmute your microphones or you can chat a question using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. But go ahead and ask away.
Maybe I put them all to sleep.
It was very informative.
Great. Thank you, Holly.
Thanks. What did you find most interesting or helpful? I'm always curious.
I guess for me, it was knowing, how to kind of slide myself into a nice sleep beforehand. things that I've been doing that I shouldn't have been doing that were on that list.
Yeah.
I know it's not helpful, but yeah,
You know,
I'll take those out and see how I do.
yeah, good. I like what you're saying. With times that reflecting on times that things are helpful. If you can do that, think of the times that you go to bed and it just feels so good. It's just so right. What are you doing
Yeah.
just before you go to sleep? What are you doing at that time? How do you quiet your mind? How do you quiet your body? And then do more of those things. We
Yeah.
aren't always going to have a choice to turn stuff off in our heads. Sometimes we kind of have to play games with that. For example, if there's something that really concerns me, I'll play this little game with myself and I'll take whatever that issue is, and I will imagine pulling a box off a shelf, opening it up, taking that issue, stuffing it in there, closing the lid, taping it about 1,000,000 times, sticking it back on the shelf, and promising myself in the morning I will take a look at that again, but not right now. And just playing some of those, little self-suggestive games, that kind of thing. So that'll help sometimes.
And Dave, you talked about bringing this discussion up at work, and I wonder, do you think that this topic lives in the wellness department of an employer, or is this something that teams should and could be talking about individually, or does it live with sort of a wellness coordinator role for the organization?
Well, I think all of those. I think in HR, for example, or maybe operations, where you're looking at actual performance and errors and efficiency, uh, it's a good place for conversation. I think in HR, when you're hiring people and you're looking at the skills they're bringing in, if you know that you have a work situation that is going to involve sleep or lack of sleep, asking them about their practices. For example, as a psychologist, one of the things that I do in emergency services is that I interview police officers for hiring for psychological exams. And I ask them about their experience with shift work and sleep, and most of them, being new people on the job, are going to get the night shift. And I ask them what they know about that and how they've dealt with that before. And I really strongly encourage them to do more reading and get training on it. And I also get back to the administrators of those corrections or law enforcement or emergency service organizations, and I let them know that these are areas where people aren't informed, that they ought to have a very candid discussion on that, and they should look at how they can help people maintain high efficiency.
Excellent. Other questions for Dave? We've got about 8 minutes left in our time. All right, I'm going to ask one. Dave, what do you think about the move to a 4-day work week and how that relates to sleep and fatigue?
Well, it depends. Many other industrialized countries have a 4-day work week. I think part of the problem is if we take a 4-day work week in order to get our 40 hours out of people, we're going to go to 12-hour shifts. That isn't saving much there. So I think it's important to have conversations about the intensity of work that we have. So many other countries have very successful businesses, and they don't drive people the way that we do. And there's nothing wrong with the work ethic, but when it becomes the dominant force in our lives, I really like that European quote. In Europe, we work in order to live. To live means being with family and personal development and contributing to the community and those kinds of things. Here we work because that's why we were put on earth. We have to work all the time. But frankly, it leads to a lot of chronic illnesses that are going to kill us early or disable us early. They're going to interfere with the work that we really believe in, especially in health and human services, even craft work, where we love to do whatever kind of craft it is. It's going to keep us from doing the things we love or we believe in. And I think it's important for us to look at how we get work done and what we can do to ensure that we have a healthy, pleasant, satisfying work environment where we develop expertise in people, and they're going to stay with us a long time because it's a good place to work.
Right. There's a question in here from Pam. I'm getting a new roof, so it's a little bit noisy. She's going to chat the question. And Pam is wondering, on one of the slides with alertness and temperature and how those are related, did it say that a higher temperature made us more alert? And just so everyone knows, I will send out the PDF of the PowerPoint. But Dave, can you answer that? Does higher temperature make us more alert?
Well, it's not that it makes us more alert, it's that the two are correlated. That when our temperature is higher, we tend to be more alert. When temperature begins to drop, that's a signal that our alertness is also probably going to drop. One of the things you might notice, for example, is at night when you get ready to go to bed, your temperature does, in fact, it's kind of nice to get the quilt and kind of wrap around you because you're a little cooler at night. In fact, one of the suggestions for sleep is room temperature. A high room temperature interferes with sleep. Somewhere around 68 degrees seems to be the average, and you may have to find it for yourself, but about 68 degrees where your room is cool allows your temperature to drop. And there are some people who say, well, you should take a hot shower because when you take a hot shower, your head, your hands, and your feet are going to have much more blood flow, and that helps disperse the heat in your body from your core, and you're going to get drowsy faster. So that's another thing that a person can do.
Very interesting. Let's see. Another one said that it was just interesting to see that the theory relating sleep and dementia and Alzheimer's. So
Yeah.
just pointing out that that is interesting, that that research is out there and it's starting to show a connection.
Yeah, and if people are interested in researching that more, it's called the glymphatic, Glymphatic, glymphatic system. And it's called glymphatic because the glial cells are structural cells in the brain, kind of hold everything together. It's kind of a network. And then the lymphatic system, as people generally know, is what flows through our body and carries a lot of materials around. So the glial cells and the lymphatic system make for the glymphatic system. So doing a search on that, you can find some really readable public science articles on that that'll explain that. And where the research is on that. I think that's one of the more fascinating things I've run across in recent years.
Excellent. We have just a few minutes left. Are there any other questions from the group? You can either unmute or chat a question. I'm scrolling through to watch for people unmuting. One person said, great information to understand the importance of sleep. And another one said, thank you for the great presentation. The theory related to sleep and dementia is interesting. Oh, that was, yep, a comment. Yeah, I think that's it for now. Final call. Oh, I'm seeing lots of thank yous now.
Oh, good. Well, thank all of you for attending and for your interest. And I please sleep well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dave. The next Inspire Success webinar series is going to be with Professor Bob Hartle on organizational dialogues, learning together, and that will be Tuesday, July 7th at 1:00 p.m. Thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.